July 19, 1943. The train screeched as its iron wheels ground against the hot rails, sparks flashing in the noonlight. Dust swirled up from the Arizona desert, sticking to the sweat of the soldiers crammed inside the boxcar. They had been told they were bound for humiliation, for punishment, perhaps even for starvation. Some whispered that America would treat them like cattle, beasts unworthy of dignity. Yet, as the brakes hissed and the cars jolted to a stop, what first filled their vision was not the cold geometry of concrete walls, nor the looming towers of machine gun nests, but a man. He leaned against a fence post, one boot hooked casually on the rail, a broad Stetson shading his eyes, a glint of metal spurs catching the merciless sun. The German prisoners pressed against the barred windows, squinting through grime and disbelief. One muttered a word that hung between awe and mockery. Cowboy. Klaus Weber had seen them before, but only in American films smuggled into Germany before the war. For most of these men, Hollywood was a land of fantasies, a world as unreal as fairy tales. Yet here he stood in flesh and dust, framed by an endless sky that seemed to mock their confinement. As the train doors clanged open, the air spilled in, thick with the smell of sagebrush, cattle, and manure. It was not the stench of war, but the odor of life itself, stubborn and unbroken. The prisoners stumbled out, blinking against the light, shackled not by chains, but by exhaustion. Their boots sank into the loose soil, so different from the cobblestones of Munich, Stuttgart, or Frankfurt. They expected jeers, rifles thrust at their ribs, snarling commands. Instead, the guards, most of them ranchers drafted into duty, simply watched with a quiet patience. And there, among them, stood more men in wide-brimmed hats and leather boots. Americans who looked less like soldiers of an industrial empire and more like characters pulled from dime novels. Corporal Hans Mueller later recalled in his diary, "I thought we had been transported into a moving picture. There were horses grazing beyond the fence, and the men who guarded us carried themselves not as tormentors, but as ranchers, watching their herd. Only we were the herd now." The irony was sharp. These were men who had fought in Rommel's Afrika Korps, who had stood in the sands of Algeria, who had believed in the myth of German superiority. Yet here, stripped of their rifles and pride, they were confronted by Americans whose weapons were not merely carbines, but a way of life. Relaxed, confident, born of wide, open spaces. To the Germans, accustomed to rigid hierarchy and shouted orders, the Cowboys' loose stance and easy silence carried a different kind of authority. A sergeant barked for them to form ranks, but even as they obeyed, many could not stop staring at the horizon. It stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and indifferent to the war that had brought them here. For men raised in the crowded cities of the Reich, this emptiness was both terrifying and liberating. The first meal arrived at dusk, served in tin bowls on long wooden tables. Klaus Weber stared at the contents, blinking in disbelief. Thick beef stew, chunks of meat floating in rich brown gravy. Fresh cornbread, still warm from the oven. White potatoes mashed with real butter. Coffee, black and bitter, steaming in chipped ceramic mugs. It was not luxury, not by American standards, but to men who had marched on empty stomachs through North Africa or survived on ersatz bread in Europe, it was excess. Some hesitated, unsure if it was a trap. A guard, his hat tipped back, urged them forward with a simple gesture. "Eat," he said, as if it required no explanation. One prisoner lifted his spoon, sipped the broth, and closed his eyes. The beef melted on his tongue. Another bit into the cornbread, and laughed quietly. It was sweet, softer than any bread he had known at home. He whispered, almost ashamed, "My family has not seen white flour in months." The others nodded, chewing in silence. Every mouthful a reminder that their loved ones back in Germany were enduring hunger. Word spread quickly. Letters home, carefully censored but still full of clues, hinted at the abundance. A camp report from 1944 recorded one prisoner writing, "Mother, do not worry for me. I eat here more meat than I did as a boy." Another noted the endless coffee, a drink reserved in Germany for the wealthy, now poured in chipped mugs without ration tickets. Some guards chuckled at the prisoners' astonishment, muttering that the menu wasn't even special. It was what any American farmhand might eat on an ordinary day. The barbed wire loomed outside, but inside the camp, the rhythms of ranch life began to seep in. After breakfast, prisoners were marched out not to punishment drills, but to work details, harvesting cotton, repairing fences, tending fields, or unloading hay bales on local ranches. Under the Geneva Convention, they could be assigned non-military labor, and in the agricultural states, their presence was desperately needed. With American men overseas, the farms lacked hands. Now the enemy carried buckets of water, hauled grain sacks, and guided plows behind mules. At first there was grumbling. Many POWs thought farm labor beneath their status as soldiers. Some tried to resist, hoping for conflict that would prove the cruelty of their captives. Yet the guards rarely raised their voices. They pointed, demonstrated, sometimes even joined in. One cowboy, sweat dripping from beneath his hat, showed a young German how to lift a hay bale without breaking his back. The prisoner, embarrassed, imitated him. Later, in the barracks, he admitted he had never before seen a man of authority help rather than order. Pay was another shock. Each man received credits, about 70 cents a day, for his labor. They could spend in the camp canteen on toiletries, stationery, even small luxuries like chocolate or cigarettes. For men who had been indoctrinated to believe they would be starved, this simple transaction felt surreal. A German corporal once joked bitterly, "I fought for Hitler and earned nothing. I pick cotton for a cowboy and I am paid." The cultural exchanges multiplied. Humor, too, bridged the gap. In one camp, prisoners played soccer inside the fence while guards cheered from the outside. A ball sailed too far, and a cowboy kicked it back with surprising skill. The Germans laughed, shouting mock applause. The guard tipped his hat, grinning. It was absurd. Enemies sharing a game. The barbed wire the only barrier between them. Yet in that absurdity lay a truth the Germans could not ignore. Humanity seeped through even the harshest boundaries. And so the conflict sharpened. Was this kindness a mask, or was it genuine? Could men raised to believe in brutality accept dignity from those they called enemies? Every meal, every handshake, every note of music pressed the question deeper. Some answered with defiance, clinging to old pride. Others silently began to wonder if they had been wrong all along. The camp's routines might have seemed ordinary to outsiders. Work, meals, rest. Yet for the prisoners, each day chipped away at certainties. Barbed wire kept them enclosed, but inside that fence ideas moved freely. They debated, they studied, they played, and slowly a different vision of freedom crept into their bones. As winter settled over the desert, the nights grew long and cold. The prisoners huddled in their bunks, blankets pulled tight, breath clouding in the frigid air. Outside the lanterns burned, and the cowboys paced slowly, their spurs clicking softly on frozen ground. Through the thin walls, the Germans could hear the faint strains of a harmonica, a lonely tune drifting across the camp. Some closed their eyes and let it carry them. Others lay awake, unsettled, realizing that captivity had given them a taste of something more dangerous than cruelty, an idea of freedom that could not be unlearned. And in the silence before sleep, one whispered question passed from bunk to bunk, a question no one dared answer aloud. If this is how America treats its prisoners, then how much freer must its people be? The war ended not with a roar in the camps, but with a whisper. Rumors moved through the barracks in the spring of 1945. Germany had surrendered. The Reich had fallen. Hitler was dead. The men sat stunned on their bunks, staring at their boots. The men sat stunned on their bunks, staring at their boots, their hands, the floorboards beneath them. Some wept quietly. Others clenched their fists, unable to imagine a world without the regime that had defined their life. But outside the wire, the cowboys moved as they always had, feeding cattle, sipping coffee, adjusting saddles before dawn. For the prisoners, the collapse of their homeland contrasted painfully with the steady rhythm of the ranch life surrounding them. The Reich had promised permanence and delivered ruin. The cowboy never promised anything, yet he endured. Repatriation began slowly. Trains lined up once more, ready to carry the defeated back across the Atlantic. Many prisoners felt relief at the prospect of going home. But there was also a knowing sorrow, an unease they could not name. Hans Müller feared returning to a Germany he no longer recognized. Klaus Weber wondered if his family would understand what he had learned about dignity. Some even sought to recreate fragments of that life. Cowboy clubs sprang up in West Germany during the 1950s. Where men donned hats, strummed guitars, and dreamed of the desert they had once seen through barbed wire. A few even named their farms with English words, quietly paying tribute to the land that had once held them prisoner but had given them dignity. Historians who have studied their letters and memoirs agree. The encounter with cowboys left a mark deeper than most realized at the time. It was not that every German abandoned old ideologies or embraced American democracy. But seeds were planted, seeds of doubt about the myths they had been fed, seeds of admiration for a way of life that seemed both foreign and enviable. As one former POW admitted decades later, I went to America an enemy. I left not a friend perhaps, but with respect. The cowboy taught me more about freedom than any general. The Americans themselves often downplayed it. For them, it was simply the right thing to do. Follow the Geneva Convention, feed the men, let them work, keep the peace. But perhaps unknowingly, they demonstrated something more profound. That power need not crush, that strength could be quiet, that freedom could be embodied in the everyday life of a rancher who tipped his hat and carried his tools. Yet for the prisoners, this generosity brought not only gratitude, but also shame. They knew their families had suffered under bombing, starvation, and fear while they had eaten beef stew and played soccer behind fences. This guilt lingered, pressing on their consciences. Some confessed they dreaded returning home, feared admitting how well they had lived in the enemy's hands. One man said bluntly, "We lived better in captivity than our people did in freedom." What does that say of us? The question could not be easily answered. It haunted them as they boarded trains, once more as the wheels carried them east as the land of cowboys receded behind them. At the docks, they looked back, toward the horizon where they had first arrived years earlier. Some carried books they had studied in camp. Others carried small carvings of horses, gifts made from scraps of wood. Many carried only memories, but all of them carried the question of what freedom truly meant and why they had only tasted it in defeat. The trains rolled on through windows. The prisoners watched the American countryside pass one last time. Fields golden with harvest, cattle grazing lazily, small towns with white church steeples. A boy waved at the train, not knowing the men inside were the enemy his father had fought. A cowboy on horseback appeared briefly, silhouetted against the sky, then vanished into the dust. The prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, as though trying to fix the image forever. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, many still spoke of that image, not of the battlefields of North Africa or the ruins of Berlin, but of a cowboy leaning on a fence, spurs shining in the sun. The memory carried both comfort and disquiet, a reminder that their war had ended not in brutality, but in a quiet lesson they had never expected. And so the story lingers, not in statistics or treaties, but in the paradox of men who discovered freedom while trapped.